Now, the recovery plan principles. Now, slide 11, actually, which is an extract from, or a summary, it's not an extract, it's a summary of what's in a PRA consultation paper from 5 years ago, which subsequently became a policy statement. Actually, you could have exactly all of that described in an ICAP and it wouldn't be inaccurate, okay? Look at that direct quote from this consultation paper. Recovery plan addresses the risk that the management of firms concentrate disproportionately on growth opportunities at the expense of preparing for, mitigating and managing downside risk. To be honest, after 12 years of Basel III, I don't think any bank is ever going to be guilty of that. Banks have to spend so much time on regulatory compliance. I can't see them, the management of these firms, spending too much time or disproportionate time on growth opportunities. I think they are obliged and required to spend a lot of time on preparing for, mitigating and managing downside risk. Hence ICAP, ILAP, STREP process. There's a lecture on STREP later on in the program. The evaluation process, recovery plan. But that was the principle behind it. You have the recovery plan and you have all those things in it. Look at the stress scenarios, look at the early warning indicators, look at your risk indicators, look at the responsibility, and then look at what options you have to restore the balance sheet to viability, to recover from stress. All that goes in your recovery plan. But as I said, that summary on slide 11 wouldn't be out of place in an ICAP or an ILAP either. Okay. What sort of stress scenarios can you have? Well, again, following regulatory guidance, there should be a market-wide one. There would be a firm-specific one, and there would be a combined market-wide and firm-specific one. You can have more stress scenarios if you wish, but 3 is the minimum. The types of scenarios are, well, some of the types of scenarios are there on slide 12. For example, what happens if there's a sovereign downgrade? Interestingly enough, I was in West Africa just last month teaching a course to a bank in Ghana. Now, the sovereign authority in Ghana last month has had an IMF bailout, and they're restructuring their sovereign debt, which is in effect a technical default. So that is way beyond the sovereign. If you look at the top right corner in that box on the top right, it's way beyond a sovereign downgrade. That's an actual sovereign default. Now, those are rare, I have to admit. But when they happen, it's a significant event. So that's a potential stress scenario to model for in your recovery plan. Look at the bottom left-hand corner, major IT failure. Again, that's a stress scenario you might want to have in your recovery planning process. Okay. Now, with each of these, we want to have again, cast your mind back to lecture 2. We want to have a fit-for-purpose set of key risk indicators and early warning indicators that give us an idea of the balance sheet position and whether it's going into potentially hazardous territory. Depletion of capital, depletion of liquidity, both some other process that's impacting your ability to carry on doing business as usual. So you want as many risk indicators in place to monitor that and calibrate them for acceptable and non-acceptable areas of risk exposure, so you get early warning of impending stress. That's the point about KRIs and EWIs. Moving on to identification and invocation. Part of the recovery plan, and there's a quote from the PRA, clear description of the escalation and decision-making processes relevant to the recovery plan as part of the firm's wider risk management framework. Now, that is something we've actually covered. If you remember from lecture 2, we had in that, when we put in place, when we described our risk management framework, we described the key risk indicators, we showed the calibration of the traffic light status, red, amber, green, or green, amber, red. In fact, if you remember, I'd put in yellow, hadn't I? So mine went green, yellow, amber, red. And then we also showed a chart that summarized escalation. When things go from green to yellow to amber, what do we do? So that is the description of the escalation and decision-making processes, which would be in our risk management framework, and we would basically put them in our recovery plan. Do you remember if from lecture 2 there was one slide that showed it was an illustration. It showed an arrow going from the bottom left to the top right across the green, yellow, amber, red spectrum of risk indicators, risk exposure, and there was an arrow going from left to right, from the bottom left to the top right. That was connecting the risk management framework, connecting the business as usual to an ICAP, to a recovery plan, to resolution. So that was a description of the escalation and decision-making processes. So if we have that in our risk management framework, we've already covered off what's required in a recovery plan. Okay, now once we have put all that in place, we'll want to know what we do in response. What are our management actions? So we will have a list of management actions specific to each stress event. So if there's a market-wide stress event that is impacting our revenue plus our capital, how are we going to restore capital? If there's a firm-specific stress event that is impacting our liquidity and funding position, how will we restore liquidity and funding capability? So that's in our management actions, okay? And within that, if you look at the third bullet point there, assess and quantify the impact of each recovery option in isolation and in combination. In other words, we will assess the impact of a specific recovery action on the balance sheet. We'll model it and say, all right, if we do this, we will recover this much capital, this much liquidity, and here is why. We'll make it a credible description. So if you look on that chart, I've just got an example of the things that might be in your management actions. We might, well, for example, if you look at the first bullet point under lending, it says reassess lending criteria and underwriting framework. Actually, it could be more severe than that. We could simply say stop lending. So what is our first management action is to no longer do any new business. If you're in a stress situation and your capital is being depleted or in danger of being depleted, the first thing you want to do is stop digging, right? You don't want to keep digging into that hole. So there could be, reassess your lending criteria, maybe do less risky lending and more safe lending. Forget that, just stop lending. Now that's quite a severe management action, isn't it? Which is why you're more likely to see it in a recovery plan than you are in an ICAP. Because if you stop doing business, your reputation will suffer. So that's a severe response to a severe event. And if you look along that table there, just examples of what might be in a management action. Again, if you look at under liquidity, it says slow down net lending, slow it down, increase deposit inflow. I might try and bring in more customer deposits to ease my funding situation. Again, if there's a reputational stress event specific to my bank, the chances of me being able to raise more funding or more capital are reduced, aren't they? So I'll need other responses if that's the case. A stress event that impacts my bank personally, as opposed to the whole market, has implications for what your recovery actions might be, your recovery options might be. Because certain things are easier to do if it's a market-wide event than they are if it's a firm-specific event.